was about 6 years old when I had the first recollection of what I thought was love. My father had beaten me up again and left me on the kitchen floor. And Pete, a gardener, had come in to help my mom pick me up and put me into the car. And although I wasn't fully conscious at the time, I do remember looking into his face and just seeing just a depth of pain, and the gentleness with which he handled me was such a sharp contrast from the black rage and violence that I used to see in my father. My stepdad was different. He didn't rage, but he was abusive. He was also an alcoholic, and with the drinking there was a sadistic, cruel side. He used to enjoy trying to make me cry, and although I didn't want to, eventually the tears would well up and just flow. One year after my mom returned from a business trip, I pulled her aside as my stepdad had broken my ribs, and I wanted to show her the bruising and the swelling. I hadn't been to see a doctor yet, and I remember looking at her face, and there was absolutely no gasp of compassion or anything like that. She simply just looked back up at me, and I remember holding onto a chair, and she simply replied that it was not financially viable right now, and then she walked out. It was at 12 years old that I realized I had no self-worth or value, even to my mother. With the Angolan Bush War, I was drafted into the military as soon as I finished school at 18. It was a perfect fit for me in that I was wild, angry, full of rage. Rage is actually a quality that they were actually looking for. And it also gave me an outlet for it. It wasn't just about the fighting. If I could make the selection and the training to one of the specialized units, I would gain some form of self-respect. I'd gain purpose. I would gain identity. As a child, I was taught to deal with physical pain and suppress that. As a teenager, I was taught to deal with emotional pain and suppress that. And now, in the military, I was taught to suppress one of my last emotions, and that was fear. Fear and any form of compassion just didn't have a place there. It didn't take them long to get rid of that. On one of the few occasions that we were in a base, one of my friends Lance Corporal Sixsmith, he walked in, went into the bathrooms, and he pulled the trigger. He committed suicide. They came in and they removed the body, but the rest was left up to us. We never spoke of him again. In the time that I was in the military, we had a total of 14 days back at home. 2 7-day stints, which included 2 days of travel. But in getting home, I found I couldn't relate to people, and I found myself just wanting to be back in the bush and just back relating to my stick. On one of these passes, my dad came in, and it was the first time and the only time that I ever saw him cry. He said to me that he had given the army or the military his little boy, and they gave him back an animal. I don't know what they expected, but if you take little boys, 18-year-old, and you put them into war, and they do and see stuff that little boys are not meant to see, it definitely changes you. We would go into villages and we'd see little children with their feet hacked off with a panga, as the enemy would coerce them through fear and violence and intimidation to stockpile ammunition and food for them. It was a life where one day you were the hunter, and after a mission you would go and find a place to sit in the shade and eat and check weapons, ammunition, gear up, and whilst you were eating, they were burning the bodies. And then that night you would go from being the hunter to the hunted. This went on for 2 years. That was my life. In that environment, there is definitely no room for compassion. And people say that it's the lucky ones that come home, but in reality, combat veterans, they don't come home. There's always a part that never ever comes home. My son was 10 years old one day, and he told me that I had what he called death eyes. They say that the eyes are the window to the soul, and when you take a man's soul, what is left is just a shadow, and it's the shadow of the valley of death. About 2 months before I was due to finish up, I blew my knee out, and I had to go into the military hospital for surgery. And then 3 days after the surgery, I tripped, fell, tore everything, and was admitted back into hospital. I got septicemia, and there was a good chance that they may had to have amputated my leg because of septicemia. After multiple surgeries, and the muscles atrophied really badly, and then eventually the knee joint froze. I had 7 degrees of movement left in my knee joint. At that point, the doctors came to me and they said to me that I would need to consider a different sport, as I would probably never ever run again, and their best prognosis was that I would walk with a cane for the rest of my life. After 8.5 months of a lot of physiotherapy and a lot of work, I was discharged from the military and discharged from that hospital, and I walked out that day on my own 2 feet with no cane. They told me I was going home. Home, nothing could be further from the truth. When I went home, I found it incredibly hard to relate and transition back into society. The military had taken literally months to train us physically, but also to train our way of thinking and our minds. And now we were expected to just transition back into civilian life with no guidance, no help. And I really and truly just couldn't do it. The freedom to choose and to have choices was way too overwhelming. I needed the simplicity of the military. Waking up in the morning and as to what time I was going to wake up, what I was going to wear, or even how I was going to stand in front of someone when speaking to them. Those choices became way too overwhelming. My choice to go into sport was an attempt to recreate myself. I started getting back into triathlon training, and I used the same discipline and military strategy with that. 5:45 every morning, I beg your pardon, 4:45 every morning, I would be on my bike, starting my cycle. My day would comprise of an 80-kilometer cycle. Lunchtime would be a 15-kilometer run, and then in the evening after work, I'd have a swim session from anywhere between 3 and 5 kilometers. On the way home, I'd stop in at the gym, get home, eat, sleep, and start again. On my days off from work, I would simply double the distances. What I was doing is I was running away from myself, and it didn't work. Eventually, I would become one of my country's top ultra-distance athletes, and ultimately competing in 3 consecutive world championships in France. And that also didn't do it. So I began to add sex and promiscuity to my life. The thinking behind that was that if somebody would accept me in that regard, I must have some sort of self-worth. And I think that's what the whole pursuit was to give myself a purpose, find an identity, and find some sort of value. My sporting career came to an abrupt end, and when that happened, I then added drugs to the equation, and I spiraled downward very quickly. Failed marriage. I had no identity as a sportsman anymore. My military career was over. Everything was gone, and I eventually went and sought help with a therapist, and after 3 sessions she turned around and said to me that I had issues, but she didn't know how to help me. At that point I crashed. I remember that day being extremely hot as I sat in my truck, and just a mixture of sweat and tears. I'd tried to pull the trigger a number of times, and I couldn't do it. I failed in that also. At this point, I hit rock bottom. It was, through my eyes, I had absolutely nothing. Friends, family couldn't relate at all, and therefore I was alone. My life had literally amounted to nothing and was going nowhere, and I was a mess. A couple of days later, they brought me out of sleep therapy in a psych ward of the hospital, and in counseling they told me that they took 5 policemen to subdue me that day, and that they looked as bad as what I did. So I apparently put up quite a fight. For the next 2.5 months, it was pretty much a medicated fog. I stayed inside, didn't go out, and I built jigsaw puzzles. Just sat around and built jigsaw puzzles, day in and day out. But God is my favorite verse in the Bible. In 2003, I immigrated here to the United States, and I began to attend a little church called Calvary Chapel. Months later, I started to help out with the kids ministry. First, in the beginning, it was like first and second grade, and then second and third grade. And the amazing thing was that the more I poured myself into those kids, the more God worked on me. I spent a number of years with the little kids, then moved up into the junior highs, and eventually I became a youth pastor. Kids are pretty amazing. They are non-judgmental, and they genuinely accept you for who you are. And I found that what had happened to me as a child, I was now equipped to and would use in youth ministry. When one of the kids would open up and talk to me about stuff that they were going through, I was able to then tell them about my past, what I'd been through, and they would realize and understand that I could fully relate to what they were going through, and there would be an immediate connection and bond. One of the amazing things that began to happen with kids ministry is I began to actually get feelings back again, and I found myself really and truly starting to love on those kids. God's word promises that He will take your heart of stone and He'll give you a heart of flesh. I am whole. I'm not perfect, but I've started to live again. I see color outside in nature. I love nature. I live every day to the fullest. I have a plan. I have a purpose for my life. I have joy. At night when I sleep, I don't dream near as much. And when I do dream, I don't wake up with the sheets torn. I don't wake up with bruises on my arms where I'm clutching myself, trying to stay alive and fighting. I have started to live again. I have peace. God's word promises that He has a plan and a purpose to give you a future and a hope. And that's what I have. I accepted Christ in 1997 back in South Africa, and months later I had a vision. A white cowboy fence. It is a fence with the wooden upright posts and 3 cross sections painted white. I was standing on the middle crossbeam and looking out over a field. In comparison to the fence, I was small, and on the other side of the fence the plowed field stretched out as far as I could see. Where the earth had been tilled, the ground was in huge clumps, indicating how hard and dry the soil was. I instinctively knew that the hard, dry ground represented my future ministry, as being a place where the word was scarce and the people were hard to reach. Yet at that time I had no desire or intention of ever even going into the ministry. I had no clue about the cowboy fence, and I actually had to go and look it up on the internet just to see what it was called. We don't typically have cowboy fences in South Africa. It's the kind of fence I saw in Western cowboy movies. 21 years later, in May 2018, I opened up a little church in rural Campwood, Texas. There are rodeos, cowboys, and cowboy fences. Breaking Bread Ministries focuses and reaches out to those who are broken and hurting, hard, dry ground to plow. As a pastor, I do not believe in preaching, but rather in correctly teaching God's word and then simply trusting that God will do the preaching as He sees fit. I also see the Bible full of healing, which is done through the ministering or the application of the word. My greatest healing has not to do with physical pain or injury. It is a far greater healing than that. My healing has come from the restoration of me, a plan, a purpose, and a peace that surpasses all understanding. I donated my 33-acre ranch, and it is now a church and retreat center. We have begun to build, breaking the hard ground. Once the sanctuary is completed, we will again begin construction on the accommodation and facilities. The Texas Hill Country is also known as God's country. It naturally provides a setting of peace and tranquility for combating PTSD. Focusing on God's Word and educating the individual on something that causes so many to just simply give up. It is my vision that we will provide both understanding and healing.